Tonight, we're going to move from one approach to defending the resurrection to another. So we've been looking at what's called the minimal facts approach, which takes a small number of facts that everybody agrees to, so that we don't have to worry about arguing for them, but instead we can just take these facts and argue from them for the resurrection. So that's what we've been doing. But tonight, we're looking at something different. I've titled this the Christian Mutations approach. It sounds kind of funny. We're not talking about the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles tonight. I'll explain it in a little bit more detail later, but basically what this is it points out different mutations from Judaism to first century Christianity. Because remember, Christianity rose out of Judaism, but there were some mutations in beliefs, some very common beliefs in Judaism that for some reason changed. And the question is, why did they change? And then we'll see that they point to the resurrection of Jesus. So we'll see if my little thing works tonight. There we go. All right, so the objective is to outline N.T. Wright's defense of the resurrection, which is what I've labeled the Christian Mutations approach. The big idea is that only the bodily resurrection can account for the rise of early Christian belief in the resurrection. So we'll look at, again, what it was that caused this early rise, and that does in fact point to the bodily resurrection of Jesus. All right, this man right here, he is my supervisor for my doctoral project. So there's a face to the name. I've mentioned him a couple of times. This is Dr. Ted Cable. And this is just a comment that he makes in an article on N.T. Wright's book, The Resurrection of the Son of God. So this is a real thick book. And in fact, I'll come back to a question that you brought up, Ray, in our last session. You were asking about, when I was talking about the trend in scholarship towards bodily resurrection, you asked if that's something that has increased. And I think it actually has. After I thought about that some, because of works like this, like N.T. Wright's book on the resurrection, and there was another one that I mentioned that I had to read for one of my classes, real thick book, called The Resurrection of Jesus, a New Historiographic Approach. Both of these books came kind of right on the heels of Habermas's study on the scholarship, and so these have made a big impact. So you'll see this is a rather big book as well. There's the picture of N.T. Wright's book, The Resurrection of the Son of God. And here's what he argues in the book. This is kind of his thesis. He says, the combination of empty tomb and appearances of the living Jesus form a set of circumstances which itself is both necessary and sufficient for the rise of early Christian belief. Let me pause right there for a second. So we're talking about some of the same things that we've talked about over the past few weeks. Most important are the appearances and the empty tomb, right? Those two things especially point to the resurrection of Jesus. And what N.T. Wright is saying is that only the appearances of Jesus and the empty tomb can explain why early Christian belief arose in the form that it did. And that is in fact completely sufficient to explain this rise of early Christian belief. He says, without these phenomena, that is, without the empty tomb and the appearances, we cannot explain why this belief came into existence or took the shape it did. But with them, we can explain it exactly and precisely. And so that's the case that he's making in the book. Another quote from N.T. Wright. He says, early Christian belief in resurrection is clearly not something derived from any form of paganism. It is a mutation from within Judaism, or rather 6 mutations. So again, this is where we get this title, the Christian Mutation Approach. And I want to point out, he says, early Christian belief in resurrection. He doesn't say the resurrection, because he's not only talking about Jesus' resurrection, but he's talking about our resurrection, which is what we've been talking a lot about on Sunday mornings at 1 Corinthians 15. He's saying this belief in Jesus' resurrection, this belief in the future resurrection of the dead, the form that it took in early Christianity, it comes from Judaism, right? Christianity didn't rise out of paganism. It arose out of first century Jews. And he says that we see these mutations from Judaism. And again, these mutations can only be explained by the resurrection of Jesus, or by the empty tomb and appearances, which, of course, points to the resurrection of Jesus. So we'll just look at these one by one. 6 mutations. So the first is that belief in resurrection, again, this is not the resurrection, but resurrection in general, right? Belief in resurrection moved from being a peripheral item of belief to the very center. So we see in the Old Testament that there is teaching of the resurrection of the dead, but it was not nearly as central as it is in the New Testament. Why did this change take place? Well, we would point to the resurrection of Jesus. But let me read this quote from N.T. Wright, noting the change. He says, "There is general agreement that for much of the Old Testament, the idea of resurrection is, to put it at its strongest, deeply asleep, only to be woken by echoes from later times in text." Now, I would say awakened, but I think since he's a British, maybe they say woken. I don't know. The point is, and we see this with a lot of things, don't we? That, for example, not only do we see it with the resurrection of the dead, but just with the idea of the Messiah being a suffering servant. Well, we see that clearly in some texts in Isaiah, but we're looking back in retrospect. We're looking back and saying, okay, now we can see these passages in the Old Testament that say that Jesus was going to be this suffering servant. But there are a lot of passages, there are perhaps more passages in the Old Testament that talk about Jesus being a great king. And that's why the Jews, they didn't expect Jesus to come and live this lowly life and then to die a death on the cross. Right? In retrospect, we look back and we see texts that prophesy that. But in the first century, Jews did not expect that. And so likewise, there was talk of resurrection of the dead in the Old Testament, but it wasn't a huge component. And when he says that many of these texts are later woken from later texts and later times in text, one example would be the New Testament itself. The New Testament will not only point back to the Old Testament to emphasize these things about Jesus being a suffering servant, for example, but the New Testament will point back to passages in the Old Testament and say, okay, well, this passage is talking about the resurrection of the dead, when perhaps to the first century Jews it wasn't so clear. And so we see again that in the Old Testament, the idea of resurrection, future resurrection, it was there, but it was kind of peripheral, and it was something that wasn't right in the center. It's something that was needing to be awakened by other times in text, and it was awakened by New Testament texts, and in fact we see in the New Testament that resurrection is central. And so if we take it away from Paul's letters, take it away from other New Testament books, their whole framework is destroyed. And so we see that there's this shift. There's this shift from a resurrection being peripheral to it being right in the center. And this shift would be curious apart from the influence of Jesus' resurrection. Like, why all of a sudden did this new movement arise in which a resurrection was at the very center? Jesus' resurrection and our resurrection. Well, it's because it points to the fact that Jesus really did rise from the dead. That there was an empty tomb, that he appeared. Also, we see another mutation, and this fits right in with the sermon this morning. There was a sudden sharpening of clarity on the nature of the resurrection body. So again, the Old Testament, it does teach about the resurrection of the dead, but not only is it peripheral, while in the New Testament it's central, but it's a lot more vague in the Old Testament. The Old Testament doesn't really tell us what the resurrection body will be like. But then all of a sudden in the New Testament, there's this strong emphasis on what the resurrection body will be like. And you tell me, what will our resurrection body be like? Whose will it be like? Like Jesus's, right? And so we see that Jesus' resurrection prompted this sharpening of the nature of the resurrection body. I'll read this here. While Jewish sources are vague on what form the resurrection body will take, write notes that the early Christian sources again and again indicate that the body will be transformed into a new type of immortal physicality. Exactly what we were looking at this morning in 1 Corinthians, right? The perishable will put on imperishable, versus what is perishable what is sown perishable will be raised imperishable, what is sown in dishonor will be raised in honor. and so on. There's that transformation. So there we have Jesus' resurrection being the key to why this change took place. Number 3, a shift from a wide spectrum of belief in what happens after death to a very strong and unified affirmation of the resurrection took place. And so this is similar to what we saw in the first one. The first one noting that in the Old Testament, resurrection was peripheral, on the New Testament it was central. But just among the common beliefs of the people, it became something that was debated during Old Testament times. For example, what was the big difference between the Pharisees and the Sadducees?
Pharisees believed in resurrection and the Sadducees
didn't. Yeah. So the Sadducees would represent a very large portion of Jews that did not believe in the resurrection of the dead. Now again, we do see that teaching in the Old Testament, but it wasn't as central, and so it was easier for that to be overlooked. And so there was a wide spectrum of belief on, is there a resurrection of the dead? Pharisees said there was, Sadducees said there wasn't. There were other theories on what would happen after death. But in the New Testament, the early church, all of a sudden, seemingly out of nowhere, there's this strong belief, this uniformed affirmation of resurrection, of future resurrection. And again, that points to Jesus' resurrection. Jesus' resurrection made a difference and changed the theology of these first century Jews. And so belief in resurrection not only became central, as we see in the first mutation, not only became specific, as we see in the second mutation, that is the nature of the resurrection body, but it also became quite homogeneous, meaning that they all, there was a unanimous belief in resurrection. Apart from some outliers, like, for example, the Corinthians, some of them were denying the resurrection in the text in the 1 Corinthians 15 that we've been looking at, and Paul comes against them very strongly because it's way out of line. It's not something that's up for debate. Okay, so those are the first 3. We've got 3 more to go, but any questions on these before we move on? So you understand that this is quite a different approach from what we've been looking at the past few weeks, but it shows how we can kind of come at it from different angles. And so rather than arguing for some minimal facts and saying, okay, here's what everybody agrees on, here's why they agree on these facts, now let's move to the resurrection from these. Instead, what N.T. Wright is doing is he's saying, okay, rather than arguing for facts and putting them together, let's just look at what the early Christians believed and see that it points to the empty tomb and the appearances of Jesus. Nothing else can explain them. So it almost kind of reverses the process. We're looking at their beliefs and saying that, okay, the only explanation for them is the empty tomb and the appearances, which of course would equal Jesus' resurrection. All right. One more quote before we move to number 4. N.T. Wright, he says, from Paul to Tertullian, there is development and reflection about what precisely resurrection would mean and how to argue it before a skeptical audience. In fact, Emily and I were just talking just a moment ago about her Sunday school lesson this morning in Ruthie's class. Acts 17, right? Paul has preached to the people in Athens, and he had preached about the resurrection of the dead. And it says, when some heard about the resurrection of the dead, some of them mocked, some of them said, I want to hear more, some of them believed. Right, so there were different responses, but we see there Paul in Acts 17 that he's preaching the resurrection of the dead before a skeptical audience, as N.T. Wright points out here. And so we see this in the New Testament, and we see it even throughout the early church, this development and reflection on what resurrection is and how to argue it before a skeptical audience. That's something that really went counter, and it goes counter in our day as well. We talked about Gnosticism, the belief that was arising in the first century, this idea matter is bad, the spiritual is good. So when Paul is arguing before these Greeks who are steeped in this Greco-Roman philosophy, he's going against the grain to teach the resurrection of the dead. And even today, we're kind of going against the grain to teach the resurrection of the dead. And yet at the same time, it is ultimately, I think, more appealing to the average person than disembodied existence. It's almost like we've been duped, and we've convinced ourselves that, okay, my spirit going to be in heaven in this disembodied existence for all eternity, that's bliss. But then when we hear about the resurrection of the dead, I think that there's something that appeals to us because we know that God has created us to be body and spirit. And there is something more exciting about being raised in a new body on a new earth for all eternity. So even though maybe philosophy has run counter to it, and it's something that's even infected the church, I think we all still have that sense deep down inside that it is more wonderful than disembodied existence. Any thoughts or questions on that? Because I've been preaching on, on Sunday nights we've been talking about Jesus' resurrection in particular. Sunday mornings is when I've been talking about our resurrection, but we haven't had the chance to have much discussion on our resurrection and what that means, or any questions about that. So any questions or comments on that before we move on?
I'm going to ask the obvious.
Okay.
When we die, when we come back, resurrected, do we come back at the same age we died, or?
Yeah, that's a good question.
You can't really answer that.
Yeah. Paula asked, do we come back the same age? Yeah, I mean, there's of course nothing in the Bible that explicitly addresses that. But what makes a 90-year-old look like a 90-year-old? Well, maybe you're hunched over a little bit and you're wrinkled, and so of course those things will not be present because our bodies will be perfect. So I would say a 90-year-old is not going to look like a 90-year-old, and maybe even a 50-year-old is not going to look like a 50-year-old, because what makes a 50-year-old look like a 50-year-old is also the same, aging kind of. You're a wonderful looking 50-year-old, but
I'm 61.
Yeah. But anyway, I think you get the idea.
Shut up.
Any other questions or thoughts there? Okay, so let's continue on with these mutations. So you've seen these first three. We've got three more to go. This one's really interesting. The resurrection as an event was split in two. So the Old Testament, even though it was kind of peripheral, the Old Testament did teach the resurrection of the dead. But it was just simply this idea that it'll be a one-stage event. But in fact, we see in the New Testament that it's a two-stage event. Now, it's really lopsided because we've got one person and then the rest, right? That is Jesus and then us. So here's a verse from 1 Corinthians 15. For as in Adam all die, so also in Christ all shall be made alive. But each in his own order, Christ the first fruits, then at his coming those who belong to Christ. So in one sense, the first stage of the resurrection of the dead has already taken place, right? Christ is the first fruit. That's why we can say that Jesus is the prototype for our resurrection. He's the first fruit. So just as we talked about, I think last week or a couple weeks ago, Sunday morning, when you have a crop, that first fruit is the sign that a bigger harvest is to come, right? But it's all the harvest. So in the same sense, Jesus, he is the first stage of the resurrection of the dead, and he's what guarantees our resurrection. And so that was something that was, it wasn't thought of. There would have been no reason just to come up with that out of the blue, right? So Wright argues that this is such a novel idea that it's not likely to have been simply imagined by the disciples. Why would there just be this out of the blue this new theology that the Messiah would rise first, and then who knows how many hundreds, thousands of years later, the rest would be resurrected. This belief came as a result of the fact that Jesus did in fact rise from the dead. Number 5, resurrection began to function in a newly metaphorical way. So, of course, resurrection maintained its literal meaning in that the dead will be raised. But the Bible does, the New Testament does speak of resurrection in a metaphorical way. And we see it's spoken of metaphorically in the Old Testament as well, but it's used differently. So in the Old Testament, we see, for example, in Ezekiel 37, that resurrection is used as a metaphor for exile, for return from exile. But then in the New Testament, we see that resurrection represents newness of life, holiness. So we see that Romans 6, Colossians 2 and 3. Let's look at Romans 6 in particular. We were buried, therefore, with him by baptism in death, in order that just as Christ was raised from the dead by the glory of the Father, we too might walk in newness of life. Okay? So baptism does ultimately point to our future resurrection, right? Being buried with Christ in baptism, being raised to walk. But there is a metaphorical meaning as well, right? We're raised to walk in newness of life, right? That we too might walk in newness of life. And so resurrection has this metaphorical meaning of walking in newness of life, walking in holiness. And is connected with Jesus' resurrection, right? And so it's Jesus' resurrection that brought on this new metaphorical meaning that we see in Romans 6. We see it also in Colossians 2 and 3. Even just the act of baptism, right? The act of baptism points to, or let me back up, because baptism itself was actually, it predates Christianity, right? Baptism was a cleansing ceremony, but in Christianity, baptism took on a new meaning, and it was pointing to the resurrection in a metaphorical way, and then also even in a literal way. And then number 6, this is the last mutation. The belief that the Messiah would, and indeed did, rise from the dead suddenly arose. So do you realize that before Christianity, there wasn't this idea that the Messiah would rise again? This is another example of text in the Old Testament being awakened, or woken, as N.T. Wright would say, by later times in text. So we pointed out with the resurrection of the dead. I pointed out with Jesus being a suffering servant and dying a death on the cross. But even these passages in the Old Testament that predict the Messiah's resurrection, they really aren't all that clear. And it's something that wasn't noticed until after the fact. And then we see the New Testament authors going back to these Old Testament texts and saying, okay, this is what this Old Testament text means. It means that the Messiah will rise. But that was not a common belief in first century Judaism. Nobody expected the Messiah to be raised from the dead, for the simple reason that nobody in Judaism at the time expected a Messiah who would die, especially one who would die shamefully and violently, right? So they didn't expect him to be this suffering servant that would take on our sins. They expected him to be this great military ruler that would bring in this new reign. And so they didn't expect him to die, and therefore they didn't expect him to be raised from the dead. And so they missed all of these prophetic passages in the Old Testament, right? And it's easy for us when we look back in retrospect, we say, how in the world could they miss this? Like, if he was pierced for our transgressions, crushed for our sins, the punishment that brought us peace was upon him. By his wounds we are healed. How in the world can you not see that refers to the resurrection? Well, we can see that, or to the crucifixion. Well, we can see that in retrospect. But back then, you have to understand there were also all these verses. But he will reign forever. What we read this morning in the call to worship from Isaiah 9, the government will be upon his shoulders, and of his government there will be no increase. And we have this picture of this great ruler. So I can understand the first century Jews and those before them kind of looking at these passages and saying, okay, well, yeah, I understand these. I understand this saying the Messiah is going to be this great ruler. This suffering servant stuff, I don't really know. Maybe it means this, maybe it means that. But what I know is that it says this, and we can kind of do that today, can't we? We look at passages in the Bible, and sometimes we might not understand one passage, or we understand another, and so we kind of just brush this other passage aside. We want to do our best to fit it all together, but sometimes it's hard. In retrospect, we can fit it together, and we say, okay, the Messiah actually comes in two stages. He comes first as a suffering servant who dies and takes the penalty of our sins, and then he rises from the dead, and there are even texts in the Old Testament that points to that weren't really noticed then, but we can see them now. And then he will be at the right hand of the Father, and he will return again. And that's when he'll come in great power and glory and establish his kingdom forever. So we understand that now, but they didn't understand that. They did not believe that the Messiah would die, much less rise from the dead. And I'll give you an example from history. And this is an example after Jesus, but you see probably about, this is N.T. Wright's assessment at least, about 200 years before Christ and 200 years after Christ. So think kind of this 400-year period, there are actually a number of people who claim to be the Messiah. But what would happen is, there would be some kind of, the Romans would come against them, and they would be destroyed, or the movement would die out for whatever reason, and everybody would just kind of go on their way. And that was that. Here's a really, really clear example. Bar Kokhba, I don't know if I'm going to pronounce this right, Bar Kokhba, was hailed as the Messiah. This is 132 AD. Was hailed as the Messiah, and there were even new coins minted under the belief that he was ushering in this new kingdom, right? So the calendar was started all over by his followers, at least. They minted coins with the year 1, the year 2, the year 3. This is the Messiah. This is the kingdom of God that has come, that is promised to us in the Old Testament. So we see a picture of one of the coins here, front and back, there on the screen. And so you see the one on the left has a rebuilt temple. By this time, in 132 AD, the temple had been destroyed. But they believe the Messiah is going to usher in this new reign, and that the temple is going to be rebuilt. And I don't know what year, it's hard to read, but I don't know what year that has written on it. But again, these coins, for 3 years, they minted these coins with the year 1, 2, 3. They were thoroughly convinced that this man was the Messiah. But then what happened? Well, after that year 3, after that third year, Rome came in and conquered this movement. This man was killed. And what did they do? Well, they claimed he's still the Messiah, we're going to follow him, and we're going to die for him, and in our last breath, we're going to... No, they didn't do that. They said, oh, well, he must not have been the Messiah. That's what they would do. When someone claimed to be the Messiah, and this Messiah would die, they'd say, oh, well, he must not have been the Messiah. Well, why did they do that with Jesus? If there were so many people who claimed, I'm the Messiah, I'm going to... And then they were conquered, and then they died. Why with Jesus did they not do the same as they did with all the others? Because Jesus rose from the dead. And that's what gave them the conviction that Jesus was indeed the Messiah, even after he had suffered death, which the disciples themselves, they did not expect that, right? They were very distraught and disheartened. Peter denied Jesus 3 times. Right? They were not, even though Jesus had predicted it, they just could not get it in their mind that this was God's plan for the Messiah. And so if Jesus had just remained in the grave, then the disciples would have remained in the state that they were in, this very distraught and defeated state. But Christ rose, and that's, well, we know the rest of the story. All right, so that is mutation number 6. N.T. Wright says, so this is, I kind of got excited and said this myself in my own words, but I'll read his words. He says, in contrast to the example that I just gave, he says, but not only did the Christians the early Christians, believed that the Messiah had been raised from the dead, they made the resurrection a key element in their demonstration that he was the Messiah, developing several brand new exegetical arguments to make the point, particularly from Psalms and Isaiah, as in Romans 1, Romans 15, Acts 2, and so forth. So he's pointing out that New Testament texts where they point back to Psalms and Isaiah, other Old Testament texts, to make an argument for the resurrection. And these were new exegetical arguments, meaning that these texts, these Old Testament texts, had not been read this way before, but now, in light of Jesus' resurrection, they're able to see the meaning of these texts. And so, in my Sunday school class this morning, I imagine Dale's Sunday school, were y'all in the book of Acts? You're not in Dale's Sunday school. Yes, we all start Acts this morning. Yeah, so in Acts chapter 13, right, we have Paul and his sermon that he gives, and he's arguing for the resurrection of Jesus, and he points to the Psalms, to Psalm 110, I believe. And we actually see the same argument made by Peter in Acts chapter 2, pointing to the Psalms. And then also Isaiah and others are referred to in different New Testament books. And so these arguments were made in light of Jesus' resurrection. And I think that's a very powerful argument. All right. Any questions on those three mutations or anything that we've talked about so far? All right. So here is Wright's conclusion. He says, all of this forces us as historians to ask a very simple question. Why did all the early Christians known to us, from the earliest times for which we have evidence, have this very new but remarkably unanimous view of resurrection? Right? So we see that all these mutations took place in first century Judaism with these Christians that arose from first century Judaism. See, all of these changes in their belief about resurrection just suddenly took place. The historian has to ask, why did they change their beliefs in all these things? And the answer is clear to N.T. Wright. He says the tomb was empty and the risen Jesus appeared to his disciples. Right? These were the things that convinced the disciples that Jesus had risen from the dead. And these are the things that prompted their change in belief. Right? These two phenomena, that is the empty tomb and the risen Jesus, together, he argues, are both necessary and sufficient for the rise of early Christian belief. Right? They're necessary explanations. Without them, we don't understand why in the world would they have these new beliefs. Right? So it's necessary that we have some explanation, and the empty tomb and the appearances not only are necessary, but they're sufficient to explain that. All right, I'll give you a little surprise here. So some of you might remember Antony Flew. I mentioned him a couple of times, but the first mention I made of him was, I think, just in the second teaching session I gave, when I showed you these 12 known facts that Gary Habermas had put together. These are 12, so it's kind of the broader list of facts, but these are 12 facts that historians, scholars of all stripes, believers, unbelievers, agree to. These are facts pertaining to Jesus' resurrection. And I noted that in a debate with Gary Habermas, that Antony Flew, who is widely regarded as the most notorious atheist of the 20th century, that he actually agreed to all these facts. Now, he was arguing against the resurrection of Jesus, but he agreed to these facts, and he said, okay, yes, these facts are true, and the majority of scholars would agree to those facts. So I noted that. What I didn't tell you is that Antony Flew later came to believe that there is a God. Now, unfortunately, he did not become a Christian. He became a deist, which basically is the idea that there is a God, but he's kind of detached from us. He's kind of the supernatural being that began, that kind of put things into motion, and he's the creator of the universe. But as far as like all the trappings of Christianity, he never came to accept them. But he did write a book. He wrote this book, There Is a God, how the world's most notorious atheist changed his mind. By the way, one of the things that really changed his mind, one of the biggest things was research in DNA, understanding the complexity of DNA, and just coming to a belief that you can't explain this by purely natural processes. But there were many philosophical reasons, all kinds of reasons why Antony Flew became a believer in God. He didn't become a Christian, but you can tell that he had a respect for Christianity. Unfortunately, he passed away about 5 years ago now. There's no indication that he became a Christian. We can pray that he did, or hope that he did, but he at least did have a respect for Christianity. And at the end of his book, so I've read this book, and actually one of my favorite parts of the book was this appendix at the end. Just in an appendix at the end, he had N.T. Wright give a version of this argument that I've been presenting tonight for the resurrection. And here's what N.T. Wright, this non-Christian philosopher, had to say about N.T. Wright's approach. He says, "I am very impressed with Bishop Wright's approach, which is absolutely fresh. He presents the case for Christianity as something new for the first time. This is enormously important, especially in the United Kingdom, where the Christian religion has virtually disappeared. It is absolutely wonderful, absolutely radical, and very powerful." And so that's coming from Antony Flew. Again, it's very sad that there's no indication that he became a Christian, but I think that speaks to the persuasiveness of this case. All right. My goodness, I might finish early tonight, even if you have some questions. Next week, we're going to look at the resurrection and the Gospels. And so pretty much have finished as far as giving a defense of the resurrection. What I want to do next week is look at the Gospel accounts. We haven't spent a lot of time in the Gospel accounts. Really, a lot of it's been anchored in 1 Corinthians 15. But I want to look at the Gospel accounts, and we'll note some things that are useful in making a case for the resurrection. For example, the women finding the empty tomb, which we have noted that, so we touch on the Gospels a little bit. But we'll look at some things like that. But also, one thing I want to talk about is sometimes people will point out things in the Gospels that appear to contradict one another. I'd say, well, was there one angel or two angels at the tomb? How many women were at the tomb? Because there are apparent contradictions. That is to say that it looks like there are some contradictions between the Gospels. But I want to show how if we look really closely, we can actually make sense of this. And in fact, I think that these differences actually testify to the eyewitness testimony. Because as with all eyewitness testimony, there's going to be different ways of telling the story, and different details are going to be included. But we'll see as we look closely that certain details are assumed by one author and they're explicitly stated by another. But we can actually fit these things together. So we'll kind of just do a hodgepodge of things as we look at the resurrection accounts in the Gospels. Okay, and then that will be our final night, and I'll, if you would be so gracious to take the survey once again, then we'll do that at the end. Okay.